Well, thank you very much, and thank you, John, for that introduction. It's a pleasure to be with you in person, indeed, which unfortunately wasn't possible last year. I'm based in Jerusalem, and I'm in charge of, for the EU, to the West Bank and to the Gaza Strip, which, of course, to the latter, I haven't been able to go since October 7th, since diplomats are not allowed into the Strip. A few days ago, we marked the first anniversary of the atrocities that have been committed on October 7th, and again, as well as recalling the merciless war that has been going on in Gaza and which has extended further to the region since then. Situation on the ground isn't any better now than it was a year ago when we looked into that situation, not knowing exactly how long it would last. The destructions have reached an unimaginable level. The humanitarian needs are immense. There's a total lack of basic services. And of course, what comes to the mind, I mean, we've seen it in the previous session, is how can we avoid this also to turn into a migration crisis? So rather than managing a migration crisis, here we're trying to manage and anticipate what could become a migration crisis. Obviously, the focus is very much on the military situation on the ground, on the humanitarian needs, as I said, but if we look a little bit ahead, obviously the focus has to be political. And with that political focus, the issues at stake here about sustainability, about economic recovery, about environmental sustainability, are all the more acute in that kind of context, even if they are not the most obvious ones today. And the nexus here, very much linked, is of course the need for strong institutions. We've seen that yesterday throughout the day. Unfortunately, these institutions, very often our multilateral, multinational institutions, are also going through a heavy delegitimization crisis, which of course doesn't help. And that is linked to the international responsibility we have. It might look like a small regional conflict compared to other bigger conflicts that happen in the world. Just think of Sudan further down. But it is a conflict that has huge geopolitical implications for the region we're in. I mean, we're in the Eastern Mediterranean here and beyond. And of course, heavily charged emotionally and morally, not last and not least due to history. How are we being able in that context to foster the necessary cooperation between the parties, between the partners, sometimes I may say, and with the international community as a push? I was listening with great interest, as always, to Joe Stiglitz yesterday, and while I was listening to him, I thought, just replace the word climate change in what he's saying by Middle East or Gaza, and we are exactly in a similar scenario, in a similar situation. So I guess we can learn across the spectrum here. Now, how can we avoid this migration crisis? Through support, through political consolidation, and this is what we're trying to do. The humanitarian situation, as I mentioned, it affects more than 3 million people in the Palestinian territories. We are currently close to 2 million internally displaced people across the Gaza Strip. 1 year of unimaginable suffering with continuous bombardments, heavy ground operations, which increased even in recent days, evacuation orders, people displaced several times, crammed and packed in one small portion of the territory, and as well, a big danger, one of the most dangerous areas for humanitarian aid workers as such. 300 of them have been killed in this conflict so far. And on the West Bank side, an intensification of military operations, airstrikes, and there as well, increased political instability and with its impact as well on the economy and on the environment. How do we respond to that? The EU has spent currently and made available over 230 million humanitarian aid, air bridges with Egypt, Cyprus, Jordan. More than 3,300 tons have been cargoed in terms of medical supply and humanitarian goods, with support to the Egyptian healthcare on top of it. Unfortunately, far from being enough, access is difficult. Very few trucks get into the territory. The points of passage are extremely reduced, and on the overall also a huge waste of humanitarian goods in that situation due to the way the conflict is ongoing. Now, what impact does that have on the sustainability as we are looking at in this conflict? Well, water is, of course, at the center of what we're looking at. 97% of the water is unsafe for consumption in Gaza. The water infrastructure is damaged, the wells, the water networks, the sanitation facilities, sewages, desalination plants, which actually we have financed as international community, as EU, together with the UN. It's there, it's not functioning, lack of fuel doesn't help in order to make that happen. The displaced people, internally displaced people, influx in some parts of the territory, of course, exacerbates this in the south even more in terms of sewage discharge, etc. With this comes the health risks increased with toxic pollutions, diseases. Currently, I mean, today is the first day of the second round of polio vaccination in Gaza. Who would have thought that this could actually reappear, and how quickly that actually reappeared? Luckily, we're able to mitigate this, but again, in extremely difficult circumstances for those doing it. Medical evacuation are far from being enough. With that comes as well food insecurity. The agricultural landscape is completely destroyed. The imports are reaching with difficulties the strip. The World Food Programme estimates that less than 50% of the needed people are actually getting the aid they deserve in terms of food supply. Education, we discussed it yesterday. 95% of schools infrastructures are destroyed in Gaza and would need rebuilding. You can imagine what that means, a school year being lost. Also, after going through COVID, this comes on top of it. There's a risk of losing a generation when it comes to skills. Literacy rate in Palestine is 97%. This, of course, will be deeply affected. And there's some data to forget. And then the situation, debris. I mean, it sounds something obvious. There will be, the estimations is 37 million tons of debris. It might take up to 14 years to remove them, not knowing exactly what we would do with it either. So we're looking into this. There is a rapid damage and needs assessment that was made earlier this year, came up with the figure of 18 billion needed. This was a very, very minimal estimation. It's clear that it was twice that amount, and that amount was up to January of this year. You can imagine what it is 9 months later. It will be in hundreds of billions. The solution, of course, is restore basic services, water, health, long-term recovery. That's what we're working on. And that means also support to community development and capacity building, which includes political capacity building. And this is why we're supporting the Palestinian Authority. This is why there is an emergency plan of 400 million currently pushed in by the European Union against reforms, but of course with the aim of stabilizing the political regime of the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank and in the future in Gaza. Far from solving the issue, but it means it's a mix of a political project and institutional implementers being able to completely fulfill their role. The World Bank, but also the UN, that is currently facing this crisis of delegitimization, which of course doesn't help. The EU is ready to help in border assistance management. The missions are there ready to deploy if a political solution agreeable to all can be found. And I'll finish on a little positive note. Visiting the population of Gaza in exile in Egypt, about 120 to 180,000 Gazawi in Egypt, you would expect people who have lost everything, people who have left their lives behind. The surprising attitude is an incredible willingness and determination to go back, to rebuild. These are the people, of course, who are also the elite of tomorrow, who will rebuild: businessmen, entrepreneurs, intellectuals, university professors. They are in Cairo. They know that they will be there for another couple of years at least, but their readiness to engage with the international community and to build, and I think this is also a way of looking at sustainability. Thank you very much.